Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to today's webinar, Performance and History, How to Review It for FSVP, and Supply Chain Management. My name's Amy. I'm usually not this tongue-tied, but I'm a member of the marketing team at Perry Johnson Registrars Food Safety, Inc. I'll be facilitating today's webinar and offering technical support to our speakers. Today, we're excited to be welcoming back a familiar voice to our webinars. That's Jen Crandall of Safe Food en Route. We'll be introducing her to you shortly, but just before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping notes. To ensure audio quality, all of our attendees today are on mute. However, we do absolutely want to take any questions you might have on the material. So to ask a question, you can just go ahead and type it right into the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel, and then click send. We'll answer as many of the questions as we have time for at the end of the prepared slides. Some of the most frequent questions we get are things like, where can I find a copy of the slides, or will a recording be available? And I'm happy to say that both the slides from today's presentation and a recording of the full broadcast will be made available. The slides will be downloadable from the PGRFSI website, and the recording will be posted to the PGRFSI YouTube channel for you to review or to share the link with someone who maybe couldn't attend live. All right, and this is what the control panel probably looks like on your screen. It might look different if you're on a Mac or using a different operating system, but you'll just go ahead and click the triangle to the left of the question or question and answer tab. It should open up and have a place for you to type a question in and click send. We absolutely encourage you to send these questions in as you think of them. You don't have to wait until the end when we get to the Q&A slide. And like I said before, we are more than happy to field any questions you can think of. But now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Paul Demarin. He is the Senior Vice President of Food Safety and Supply Chain here at PGRFSI. Paul joined the company in January of last year and has over 35 years of experience in the hospitality, service, and retail agri-food sectors. Paul's a board member of the OFPA, that's the Ontario Food Protection Association, and he's also an advisory council member with the George Washington University School of Business for their digital marketing certificate program. Before he came to PGRFSI, Paul worked for 17 years in the certification industry with clients in every sector from food safety and supply chain to brand protection and quality. Paul's also worked for many years in management system certification. And prior to that, Paul was a professional chef and a consultant for over 20 years. So Paul, I'll hand things over to you and you can take it away when you're ready.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. I really appreciate that. And thank you everybody for joining our call today. I'm very excited to welcome back Jen as well. And I think as many of you know, I've changed the format for our webinars today, and we're now going to be jumping right into our main topic. So again, Jen and I will be having a discussion around supplier performance, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and supply chain management. And let me just introduce you to Jen. She's the CEO and founder for Safe Food en Route. She has a food science degree from Purdue University and has 8 years of manufacturing experience, with 12 years of those being at Kroger's corporate offices. In 2018, she founded Safe Food en Route, and Jen and her team are in the food safety consulting space, with primarily a focus on the FSMA rules, the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSVP, as well as supplier compliance management. The mission at Safe Food en Route is to make corporate food safety programs accessible to small and medium-sized companies using systems that are intentionally designed with love for people and food. So again, thank you very much, Jen. It's always a pleasure, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. So again, thank you very much. Welcome everyone that is on the webinar, and we appreciate your attendance and are excited to share with you some insights into supplier performance and history, and hopefully these will be some good tips and tools for you going forward as you manage your processes and programs. So as Paul mentioned, my background, I had several years at Kroger corporate, 12 years in fact, and so a lot of my foundational type history and things that I have done in my career, I'm pulling into how I manage my business, and hopefully these types of tips that I can share with you so that it will help you and give you some insight into what a corporate level program looks like. So first I want to talk about a little bit about supplier performance And these are just discussion topics. So this is a quick presentation, but it's meant to be a discussion between Paul and I. So I just wanted to share like supplier performance and what that looks like and some of the topics that you might cover in measuring supplier performance. So it can be through a number of things, from an FSVP, which if you're not familiar with FSVP, that's Foreign Supplier Verification Program Rule. And that is one of the Food Safety Modernization Act rules. Something that I teach a lot of my clients and people that I engage with is that the Foreign Supplier Verification Program Rule and some of the concepts that come in other Food Safety Modernization Act, all of the law and what that is, that's really meant to be a good supplier performance program, a supplier compliance program. So just from that perspective, and when you read that, read the FDA regulations, you're going to see that that is a common theme. They want you to understand your suppliers. So how do you do that? You're looking at their regulatory history, their recall history, their import alerts and warning letters, the history as a supplier to your company or to other customers. And I just saw it, I do this every time I write compliant instead of complaint, complaint history, food safety audit history, and things like that. So those are the types of things that you're looking for. There are certain areas that you can take into consideration as you're reviewing their performance. And certain places you can go look for this information to help you be able to measure their compliance. So you can go to places like the FDA dashboard, or there are other tools that you can use, such as like the GFSI audit scheme, certifications. You can do those on public searches. You can collect these documents. You can possibly use a third party to help you search. There's many ways to do it, but high level, these are the types of documents and things that I look at whenever I'm doing a supplier compliance and supplier performance review. So I'm gonna, it sounds like I just got a message, so I'm gonna be maybe opening this up a little bit more to a process of like, if you have questions, please feel free. I know Amy mentioned before, if you have questions, Paul, it sounds like had to step away. So if you want to ask questions through it, and I will try to keep in touch with the questions as well. And Amy's going to have some questions that she asked me as well. But if you have anything that you want me to answer specifically around these topics, please feel free to jump in to the chat box and communicate it to me so that I can try to answer your questions. And maybe it'll be a little bit more informal of a process than you may be used to for a webinar, but it's meant to be a discussion. It's meant to be open. So I'm happy to answer questions along the way. So do not hesitate to ask them, and I will answer them as I can through the process. So next slide, let's jump into other metrics that we can look at. So something that I've noticed that comes up, many companies do some type of other metrics for doing supplier performance. So I mentioned all of the normal ones of regulatory compliance and based on third-party food safety audits, customer complaints, and history with companies and other companies. But there are other things to think about as well that are just as important. And a lot of times companies, larger companies are doing this at least, they're measuring on their supply chain. And if you're a supplier to any of those types of companies, then you probably are familiar with some of these KPIs because you might be on the back end of them. So on-time deliveries, delivery in full, did you send the whole load? Brand performance on shelf, so they're measuring how your sellability of your product. Whoops, sorry about that. Customer complaints, quality, food safety incidents outside of the relationship, and I'll touch on that one in a minute, and then response time. So these things are typically included in a service type metric that companies have between each other, such as the ones that I've mentioned. And sometimes we look at other things like that response time to our requests or response time to an emergency situation. And so those are some of the other metrics that typically we take into consideration. And why those kind of come into play whenever you're looking at food safety, I mean, you are looking at supplier performance, and it's not that they affect the supplier food safety programs, but there's some behavioral things that you can kind of look at to see how a company is going to behave at a specific time. So if they're not responding to you when you have non-food safety incidents, how are they going to respond when you might have one? So that's some of the things that I always consider. And to dive into like, food safety incidents outside of the relationship. So companies work together, typically a supplier to a retailer or a supplier to some type of food service distribution company. They respond to each other significantly whenever there's some kind of crisis going on. But there also might have conversations that are related to just quality in general and quality problems. But they're always one-sided. They're always part of a discussion between the two companies and may not be about their performance outside of that relationship. I know I'm probably stating it and overstating it to a degree, so it might sound like I'm just being overly cautious with it, but I like to know what's going on outside of it. So that's why I think, doing some referrals programs, see how they're doing with other companies, what's the reviews on their websites, but outside of their websites, if there's a way that you can see their performance outside of your own relationship. And then food safety incidents, you can find all that data on, like I mentioned on the first slide, so you can find some of that data on the FDA website and dashboard and some of those other types of resources that might be able to share some of the recalls that you might be experiencing that are unrelated to your company. A big place that I see this type of behavior or this type of kind of like lack of transparency, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's intentional lack of transparency, just something that I've seen personally is whenever it's a distributor who's distributing product to other companies, to other customers, and they have like brand specific relationships. And so you wouldn't have that visibility necessarily with the distributor supplying one retailer with product and supplying from that same manufacturer supplying product to a different retailer. Those retailers compete, so why would they tell you all about that history? So I've seen that quite a bit, and it doesn't even have to happen at the distributor level. Sometimes it happens at the level of just the supplier in that relationship. I have been seeing a few people popping on, and just want to let you know that this is not meant to be a one-sided webinar. So if you have any questions that you think are relevant and you want to see answered, please feel free to use the chat box to be able to request that. I want to make sure that you're having a good enough experience. So we changed the format a little bit, so it's more just me and Amy talking through my slides, and Amy will be asking a few pre-thought out questions. But if you have questions that you're looking for on these topics of supplier performance, to please go ahead and ask them in the chat box, and I'll do my best to answer them before the end of the webinar.
Absolutely. Just to chime in, Jen, a question that I had over here, how would you typically recommend that different companies determine how do you weight different metrics? Which metrics should each company consider more important than, say, maybe delivery in full is more important than, customer complaints? Like, do you have any recommendations for weighting KPIs?
No, that's a great call out, and I do believe that weighted metrics are a good way to do it. So, and I'm not an expert in sourcing. I've spent some time in sourcing whenever I was working at Kroger, so I was on that front end of deciding what those KPIs were. And the way we did, it was like an entire team. So you go take a team in to discuss what the weights are. So it's not just you making that decision. And look at what's important to you, to your clients. Obviously, and coming from a regulatory background and a food safety background, I'm going to rate food safety incidents as pretty high. But you can break down and say, okay, well, what caused the recall? What and weight the the KPI based on that. So if the recall was something where something very serious happened, and it's what they call the Sakota hazard, which is severe adverse health effect or death is likely to occur. Look up the acronym because I'm butchering it right now, but Sakota hazards are what we use in the preventive controls plan, and it's a new term that the FDA introduced during FSMA. If it is something that causes that type of hazard to occur and there's a recall around it, and the way that they handled it did not make you feel warm and fuzzy, like you just looking at it going, they didn't handle that very well, that probably would be a little bit heavier weight than I would say a quality concern or a customer complaint concern. Yes, you want to measure and look at your customer complaints and make sure that you're addressing it. But maybe customer complaints gets less weight if they've only had 3 customer complaints in a 3-year period versus having 10,000. So it's difficult to say how to make your own weighted measurements in-house, but you know the history of your products, you know the history of the performance and your suppliers, you understand the history of those suppliers. So it's a team effort to kind of come up with those weights. Does that answer your question well enough, Amy?
I believe it does. So basically, it depends.
It depends.
At the end of the day, it depends.
It's not an easy answer a lot of times because of that. So, but yes, it does depend. Absolutely right. All right. So again, people jumping on, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box as we go. This is meant to be discussion. So let's revisit really quick what is on, because remember I said that FSVP, I said this in the beginning, that the FSVP program, and for those that are joining, you might not have heard what that means. That's the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rule. That's part of the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act. It's one of the rules that is on importing companies. But just revisiting what is required of an FSVP program. And what I said earlier is an FSVP program is really a really well thought out supplier compliance management program. And in my opinion, a lot of the laws are like that. Yeah, thank you. So supplier performance fits in around the evaluation and the hazard analysis. So when you're going through this process, you're looking at the product and conducting a hazard analysis. I'm going to give you a little tutorial on FSVP for a second. So you have the hazard analysis that's looking at all of the probable hazards that might happen around the food that is being imported. But that's for FSVP, which is foreign supplier, foreign to the United States. So if we're looking at it for just a supplier program and doing the same thing, what hazards are associated with the food that is being purchased? So you don't have to look at where the food is from. It might be related to where the food is from. So there might be more hazards from some specific areas of the world than there are in others. One of the hazards we consider is radiological. So where are radiological hazards? Most of us think of them when we think of nuclear waste. So those are specific regions that we've had nuclear disasters that might have caused a radiological hazard, okay? So hazard analysis, then you do an evaluation. Is the supplier mitigating those hazards? Are they managing them? If they're not, who is? Those are the questions that you ask during this supplier program. So you can collect documents such as third-party food safety audit reports. You can collect GFSI benchmark audit certificates and the audits. You can collect those all day and find some of the answers to this. But the critical part is that you have to do something with that information. So there are many things to review in the audit itself to be able to pull out these answers to an FSVP program. And it's really good. I always reiterate this anytime that I'm on a webinar or any type of presentation, if I'm on a panel or something, that is really good to have a qualified individual to review the audit to see if there are any major concerns or corrective actions that need to be taken. So I won't go into all the details of how I personally have my team do, FSVP process, but the rule says that the bullets that are here, that you have to have things written around this. So this is public information, so I'm not sharing anything different, but hazard analysis, you have to do an evaluation, you have to have an approved supplier list, you have to have established a written plan, FSVP plan, you have to verify that the hazard is being managed, you're evaluating the supplier to do that. If they're not, or if there's something that needs to be done, you're going to have corrective actions in place for that. You have to reevaluate regularly, and the law specifically says that you have to do that on a certain frequency. You have to identify the FSVP importer at entry, which could be one of 3 different entities, but all 3 have to be in the United States. And then there's record keeping. So again, going back to the theme is, you know, FSVP, foreign supplier, but it's really supplier performance. So it still comes back to looking at supplier performance and how that relates. And the beautiful thing about GFSI and the audit schemes and how those benchmark audit schemes work, a lot of these questions can be answered with those, but you can't just sit on that data. You can't just collect it and and say, oh, okay, I've collected their documents and I'm good. You're not good. That's not supplier performance evaluation. That is just collecting data. And if you collect data, then you are at risk and have probably some legal liability that you have to do something with it. You can't just have data sitting around and not use it for information to be able to finalize that performance review. So I will pause here for a second and just open it up again for questions. If there's any questions that are coming through, I know Amy, you might have 1 or 2.
Yeah, actually, as you said, Jen, anyone on the call, if you have any questions, even tangentially related to FSVP or you know, the review and everything. My question here, Jen, I know your company, Safe Food en Route, you know, you specialize in FSVP review and everything. What would you say has been the most difficult step out of this list for people in general?
Well, it comes down to that qualified individual doing the work. So kind of reiterating that you can't just collect documents to collect documents and have them on hand. You actually have to review them and make sure that you agree that the hazards associated with that product are being managed. And so if you're not trained in food safety and or like very well versed in the safety of that product and understand the hazards that the FDA or whatever regulatory agency might be putting on that product, then and if you're not trained, you may not be able to really truly evaluate, is that product managed well. So a good, like, the GFSI audit schemes, one of the things I like about them is that they place a qualified individual in the facility doing the audit. So the inspector, the auditor that's in the facility auditing against that scheme has they have knowledge and understanding of that product category before they walk in. Before GFSI was put into place, I'm just giving a little history here. Before GFSI was established, and it's been about 25 or 30 years since it's been introduced into the world. I think the United States has had adopted it since probably 2005. So we're working on 15, 16 years of adoption of it and really enforcing it. The beautiful thing is with the auditors that are coming into your facilities having that background. Before that was in place, anyone could walk in and do an audit in that facility. So for example, I have 8 years of dairy manufacturing and juice manufacturing experience in my background. I worked in a facility that had high temperature short time pasteurization unit. I've worked in one that had ultra high temperature pasteurization, and I've worked in one that's aseptic as well. And so I have enough background to be able to technically audit against those. I'm not an auditor. I just want to have that disclaimer. I'm not an auditor. What I'm saying with that is, I could have walked into a bakery and conducted an audit and given them my opinion. There's some very, very different things in a bakery versus a dairy. And, you know, just looking at it simply, wet environment dry environment, or wet environment and you have dough that is on the front end of the processing in the bakery and on the back end is dry and has lower water activity, but you in a dairy would have still high water activity. Those are very different environments, which have very different hazards. And so a person who's not qualified would, that's to me, and I'm sorry for the long route to answer that question, but to me, that's one of the most critical things is understand your product. So know your products, know your suppliers, and understand the hazards associated with the products and know what is necessary to reduce the risks and the hazards that those products bring. Long story short, sorry.
Hey, Jen, it's Paul.
Hi, Paul. Welcome back.
Hi, I'm back. I am so sorry to you and
No, no,
everyone. I had an
we
urgent
it's
meeting,
fine.
a client request that I needed to jump on. I'm so sorry, but thank you to Amy as well. You know, listen, you and I have had previous webinars as well talking about supply chain programs and the importance of them. And the various programs that you have up here are very similar to that of GFSI standards and programs. Just a couple high level questions here. Maybe I'll just kind of ask them and you can kind of jump in. But when when you're looking at the foreign supplier verification program, what exactly is the importer verifying would be my first question. Who typically do you think are subject to FSVP? And are there any of these areas on your list here that you find are often overlooked by companies when you're working with them?
So can you ask those questions again, and I'll start with
Sure. Yeah,
sorry, I just want to
no
make
problem.
sure I caught
Yeah,
them
my
all.
first one would be, when you're looking at FSVP, what is an importer actually verifying?
Okay, so, well, all right. So the verification process is kind of reviewing the first two bullets on this slide. So you're looking at the hazards associated with the product that you're importing, and then you're evaluating the supplier programs, and this, that could be in various forms. The law gives us a lot of flexibility, so we don't have to necessarily do it one specific way. So my company might do it a little differently than other companies depending on their backgrounds and knowledge. But that evaluation part of the supplier review, you're reviewing their programs to see, are they managing these hazards? That's the verification. So you're also adding a scientific perspective to it. So that verification includes the scientific perspective of, okay, I know that, like for dairy, I know the temperature has to be for high temperature short time. I need
Mhm.
to pasteurize it this number of seconds to this temperature. And so you're verifying that they're doing that because you know that that manages this hazard, the pathogens that might be associated with raw dairy products. So it's looking at each individual product that is being imported and evaluating the supplier process programs. And so, the way I do this, I use a lot of the audit reports, and my team does an extra layer of review on those to determine, do we think what the auditor read and has reported matches what we believe is managing that hazard. And then we have a lot of other questions that we go through to be able to verify. If they don't verify, then we do the corrective actions. So I think that answered one or two of those questions.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that it also, not only compliance with the documents and policies as you mentioned, but does it also, maybe you can just help clarify, but I also believe that they have to have the same level of protection or health protection that would be detailed in the hazardous analysis for the HARP-C rule or the preventative control rule. Is that correct?
Yeah. So you're looking at all the laws that are applicable to that product. So it might be the preventive controls rule, but it also might have, there might be other laws that are applicable like low acid canned food or high acids.
Right.
It might be seafood HACCP, juice HACCP, and then whether those actually, some companies don't qualify to need an FSVP because they fall under one of those other rules, or they have modified rules to it. So they might have like juice HACCP and seafood HACCP, I believe, fall into they don't have to do it, they're exempt. But very small businesses that do less than $1 million average sales in 3 years. Those companies might qualify to do a modified rule, where that means that they're just making sure that the companies acknowledge that they, and I have to be really careful the way I say it, so I don't want to say it too matter of fact. There's a little bit of
Right.
evaluation goes in, but the FDA has a modified expectation of what those companies would do versus a company that's bringing in a large volume of product and sales of 10 million a month. That's very different approach to it.
And I also understand that the importers have to verify that their food has not been adulterated or misbranded, primarily, I think, due to allergens. Is that right, or do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so
Or how they verify it?
Yeah, well, you do need to make sure that their labels are in compliance to the regulation requirements for labels. And so part of the hazard analysis is recognizing what hazards are associated with food. When you look at preventive controls and what's required for, PCQI, or that's preventive controls qualified individual. But if you're looking at the HARP-C rule, which you mentioned, which is the preventive controls rule, there's 4 hazards that we are required to review. And so you might be looking at microbiological, physical hazards, chemical hazards, which includes allergens as part of those hazards, or reviewing the radiological. And I mentioned that, I think you stepped away for a few minutes when I was talking about radiological, but the allergen, yeah, you have to modify. So, and again, going back to evaluating who is managing that hazard. So the supplier might not be managing the allergen. So let's just use that as the example. They might be not managing the hazard because let's say their entire facility, it is a bakery, and everything has wheat in it. And wheat is considered one of the, now I would say we have a big 9. I don't know what we're calling it yet, but sesame has been added to our list. But so wheat would be on that allergen list for the United States. And so why would they're not going to manage that, because they're a bakery, and why would they manage it if it's in every product? They don't need to manage it, but we need to tell the consumer about it. So in our hazard analysis and evaluation, what you'd be looking at is, do the labels state that the allergen is there, and are they stating it the way it should, the way the labels should be written? So there'd be that step and that added layer of reviewing labels.
Right. So then my next question was, who exactly is subjected to or subject to FSVP? And then I guess follow-up question to that is, what food is subjected to FSVP?
So all foods that fall under the FDA jurisdiction are required for FSVP. Okay. And who is required to do it? It's anybody who's importing into the United States is required to follow the FSVP rule. And there's great tools. I know I've shared one in the past with the webinar attendees, kind of like a decision tree and questions that you can ask to be able to kind of drill down, am I required to follow this rule or not? One of the things that's really important, and kind of jump down to the identify FSVP importer entry. Who is responsible for this is the conversation that happens around that. So when you're entering a relationship with your customer, or usually it's with the customer, so if it's a foreign facility that I'm talking about and they have a relationship with someone, the questions that come up, the way the law is written, you can be a U.S. customer, U.S. consignee, or if one of those do not exist, something like a trade show, then you need a U.S. agent. All of those are located in the United States. And the biggest difference, and maybe to answer Amy's question earlier, one of the things that I saw very early when the rule was implemented and rolled out was that companies didn't realize that there was a difference in the definition of importer for U.S. Customs versus the FDA. And U.S. Customs importer, you're allowed to live anywhere in the world, as long as you're allowed to import into the United States. So being clear, like some countries aren't allowed to have that trade agreement with us, but anyone that is allowed to import food from different areas of the world can be on the customs records as the importer. And they may or may not own the product when it enters the United States. They may not, they may, like, the ownership might be taken at port of, you know, at the port that it's being shipped out of. And so you might have a product being purchased from Paris by a customer here, and the U.S. Customs agreements and the way that all that paperwork rolls out, it's all just contractual agreements of who owns the product where and who has liability for it. For FDA, there's three: that U.S. customer, the U.S. consignee. Those are pulled right off of the paperwork of the U.S. Customs form. So somebody has to identify as FSVP importer. But they have to be in the United States. They have to understand United States law, and they have to do the verification activity and hold that information on hand. So that might muddy it a little bit, but to me, it's pretty clear. I usually can have a quick conversation with people and get to the drill down to, like, who owns the product, and then if there's in the event of two entities, so this happens quite a bit. There could be a U.S. consignee and a U.S. customer. And what needs to happen is that contract and that conversation needs to happen between those two entities, because one of those two entities has to take on the responsibility of doing this verification and maintaining all these records and making sure the suppliers are managed appropriately and the hazards of the products.
Right. And I know, FSVP, as you mentioned, applies to really all of the imported human and animal food, even dietary supplements, beverages, but there are some exceptions to that, or exemptions. Maybe you could just advise on some of those exemptions.
Yeah, so some of the exemptions I mentioned, like juice HACCP and seafood HACCP, those are definitely exempt. Alcohol and anything that falls under alcohol and tobacco would be exempt. Pharmaceuticals are not included. But as you mentioned, Paul, dietary supplements are. They have a modified rule. Water, so bottled water, I believe, has, I'd have to check. I haven't looked at bottled water in a while, and I need to verify. I don't know if it's modified or exempt. Very small businesses are modified rule, and small businesses. And there's several others. That's why I was talking about that decision tree. It gives you a lot of that kind of, yes, I qualify as this, or no, I don't qualify as this. And then it gives, if you do, then you are, it's, applicable to you.
Right.
And it's a great tool. I use it all the time, kind of go through the decision tree with clients.
Jen, one of the exemptions that I saw that I guess I'm just not a little clear on, maybe you could help clear up, is the exemption of food for research or evaluation. Can you be more specific on what that means?
If you can prove that it's not meant for consumption, so if you're sending it to a lab to be tested, or possibly just as a sample so that people can see the packaging, and they're not meant to distribute it, then that can be considered an exemption. Usually where I see that, and I do see there's a large volume of samples shipped through, freight carriers like UPS or DHL or somebody like that. And they're meant to be samples distributed within a company for approval or for some kind of evaluation. So that kind of stuff has an exemption, but you have to prove it. You have to have documentation of why. You have to still have a procedure in place to say that I've gone through that evaluation. And most likely whoever's receiving it, you and that entity would want to have some kind of contract between you stating, I understand that this is not meant for distribution, this is evaluation only. And also a best practice is marking the package and boxes with that as well.
Do you have any idea of how it's going to be, or how it has been enforced, the FSVP by the FDA?
Historically, what I've seen so far and what I've learned from people that are attorney friends and what they share in some of the conferences that they've put out, the FDA, the way they've been implementing it, they had a phased approach. of implementation of FSVP, and that, you know, initially they had large organizations that had to meet it, and then they rolled it out to the smaller organizations. So that was on like 2016, 17, 18. In 2018, we started seeing inspections, and a lot of times the inspections included things like, do you have an FSVP? And it was just a quick conversation. This is what my experience of it. They were saying, you're identified as FSVP importer. Do you have, you know, one, should you be named as FSVP importer? And two, then, you know, if you are, show me your plan. And so they would show them what's going on. But there were a lot of quickly opened citations that they were opened and closed quickly. So the FDA didn't necessarily do a warning letter on them. However, it is on public record, and there were a lot of recorded FSVP inspections. And so they were calling them educational visits. And so they did that for a year or two. And then I started seeing my company started in 2018. And I started seeing those inspections come through with clients in, you know, late 2018, early 2019. And then in 2020, I noticed that the inspections got a little bit more elaborate. And I don't know if it was because sorry, my dogs are behind me. I don't know if it's thundering, so apologies.
Yeah,
The
no
storms
problem.
are going to happen. So the pandemic, you know, the inspections are remote. So that's something that's different that a lot of people are not used to, is the FDA is going to contact you through email, and they're going to ask if you identify as the importer the way they want you to be identified. And then once they get that verification and a conversation kind of back and forth between the FDA inspector and yourself, then once they establish that, okay, we're going to conduct an inspection. And it's random, it's sampling inspections. They'll do the inspection, and so this is the differences that I noticed personally with my clients, is that the first questions were, or, you know, the first year was, do you have the inspection, or I'm sorry, do you have the verification, do you have a plan, show it to me. The next one was, what hazards have you identified? So they started kind of increasing the awareness of the program, of the, you know, the requirements, but they also started asking a little bit more in-depth questions. My prediction is the next phase is they're going to start looking at the risk assessment part of it, or the evaluation portion of it, to say, how do you know those hazards are being managed? So they're not just looking at the hazards and saying yes or no, we agree with you that you've identified the correct hazards, but now they're going to probably go in depth. This is my prediction for this year. Again, I have no way of knowing this, but I think the inspections will continue to increase, and they will start asking questions such as, you know, how do you know that the hazards are being managed?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for answering my 8-part question. Now let's move
You're
on.
welcome. Sorry, I feel like I'm going the long route, so
Yeah.
I apologize.
Okay, thanks, Jen. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go up. I mentioned GFSI is a great way of doing supplier performance reviews and that evaluation, and I know I mentioned it too in the past too. That I've mentioned, you know, that GFSI is the, you know, the part about GFSI, it stands for Global Food Safety Initiative. I put the website in the link below so you can look at it a little bit more in depth if this is a new term to you or you're just not as familiar. But the reason that corporate companies like it, and why I believe it's a really good way to do supplier performance review, is because the company, when there's findings found, non-conformances found in that audit, the company that is being audited must prove to the audit body, so they must prove to the Perry Johnson Registrars of the world, as well as the audit scheme owner. So like using as an example, you know, just using BRC as an example, BRCGS, which is the one right next to the umbrella stand. The BRCGS has to be proven in Perry Johnson Registrar's auditor. who inspected the site has to be proven that that corrective action is appropriate for what they requested. So they cannot get the certificate, the GFSI certification, the BRCGS certificate, unless they have proven to both of those entities that they have done it. So it takes a little bit of that bias out. It's a trusted certificate, and the certificate actually has meaning. It's not just, yes, it kind of like, the culture of just like participant culture, right? So it's not just I participated and got an audit, but I've proven that I have corrected the findings of the audit, and I did it in a timely way, and the auditor and the audit scheme owner both agree that what I did was appropriate. So that's one of the things that are really good. But it's really good also to remember, and why it's super important. GFSI is intended to show ongoing performance, but it is a snapshot of what's going on in the facility at that moment. There's a little bit of document review, that's historical document review, but that does not mean that the day the auditor steps out of the facility that things aren't going to go awry. The desktop review might indicate a few months worth of documents, but it's not necessarily the performance for year-long performance 24/7. It's always good to have an extra set of eyes to review the audit and determine if there are any other caution flags that might be related that the auditor might have recorded, but they might not have necessarily thought that it was a non-conformance, or they didn't weight it the same as maybe your team might. So there might be differences in you might disagree with the auditor, right? And the same with reviewing regulatory inspections and so forth. So it's just always good to have that extra step, but it's a really great tool if you're using it the appropriate way to know what's going on in the facility, seeing what's going on in it on the day that the audit happened. And then you can do an ongoing supplier performance outside of that by doing some of the other things that we mentioned before, customer complaint review. You can keep an eye on the FDA dashboard for anything that's going on regulatory wise, and looking at maybe other countries, monitoring customers, other customers of that company, and just keeping an overall eye of the news related to them. So go ahead, are there questions here?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I certainly from a certification body perspective, I know what my response is, but I'm curious from your perspective, do you think, customers and sites that are on the call here today should use the GFSI audit as a way to review their supplier performance?
I tend to say yes because of my corporate background and a lot of the retailers. So the reason I say it is twofold. One, it's a very reliable audit scheme, and it is benchmark, and there's criteria built into it to help it be just very non-biased and good representation of what's going on in the facility. So I would say that's one. But two, from a branding perspective, totally unrelated to FSVP compliance, the retailers, they're on the board of GFSI. Like Kroger has the co-chair is the vice president of Kroger's corporate food technology. They're not going anywhere. The retailers are not going to shift anytime soon away from GFSI requirements. And I would probably venture to say that neither will the larger food service companies. And so if your goals as a company is to become compliant to their programs and be able to sell to those larger organizations, a branding perspective, getting one of these audit schemes that are on the approved benchmark list that are appropriate for your product is a very good strategy. Now that's if you're doing private label. It might not be required if you're doing your own brand. And so, from that side of it, just a little free advice, you don't have to do it. You could do GMP audits, which are good manufacturing practices. I do think that it's really important for any supplier review program that, and again, this is your suppliers. So these are things that you might be doing yourself to sell your product. If you are a supplier, if you are a manufacturer and you're buying from your suppliers, you might choose to do it differently. You might not have those same requirements, but some of these audit schemes do require that you hold them to a standard. So like I think BRCGS recommends that they have, if they are BRCGS certified, that you can kind of bypass some of your things as long as you can prove they're BRCGS certified. So there's some value in that, but that doesn't take away what you need to do for foreign supplier. So there's just a lot of cadence to that question and probably a lot of layers. Personally, I mean, I've been an advocate for GFSI since 2008 because that was part of my job responsibilities and monitoring the compliance of it to the Kroger programs, and I continue to be an advocate for it because I understand the spirit of it. And then the other side of it is one audit. It's supposed to be one audit accepted by all. I can't say all retailers will do that. Like if you are in Europe, you know that BRCGS and IFS commonly are audited together. So just a little branding things as well.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's go to on-site visits, and that's something we haven't really talked about. But coming from that corporate background and personal experience, 23 years in the industry, I think it's extremely helpful to have an on-site visit. So just discussing the spirit of GFSI and the one audit accepted by all. That is not always that's not always the case. So sometimes you still need to do an on-site visit from the customer perspective. I think it's really it's helpful because a piece of paper can't always show you the picture of what's going on in the facility. And I do recommend visiting companies before doing business, if at all possible. I know COVID restrictions have kind of slowed that down, but I do believe that's something that we could do a little bit more. The extra step of going to them really helps you understand the facility, fully know what's going on there, and gives you some of the intangible things that you can't see written on a piece of paper. But it also gives you that human connection. And in my experience, the human connection is something that's very different in general. You have that bond, that relationship developing, and it's also very important just to know that a facility can score very well on one of those audits, and they can have really poorly developed programs depending on what scheme that they are working towards. So if they're doing one of the kind of stepping stone schemes, they might score really well because they're on the mature side of that audit scheme, but they are working to improve. So you still want to walk in and see it. And from the opposite perspective, even though it's trying to remove some of the bias from the auditors that are going into the facility, sometimes you can have a really scrutinized audit that represents companies, and I've had this happen before. It's very scrutinized. There's a lot of detail and a lot of written up things that the auditor saw that they see needs to be improved. And when I walked on site to the facility, I was like, oh my gosh, they're immaculate. Now they might have been doing their programs in a way for me that was just like making it look pretty the day I was on site because I was a purchaser, but at the same time, it gave me some perspective, like maybe the auditor was a little harsh on them. So that's my side of it. So I think it's always important to go. And again, it's a snapshot in time. So you never know what changes day to day, month to month, quarter to quarter, and you want to have an ample opportunity to see what they are doing and who they are and what they do and understand the culture. You can't always read the culture in an audit report. You can see it sometimes if you visit, but your visit has to be structured in a way that helps you have access to it. And that's not always something you can do either. I mean, even in any industry that you're in, getting your home inspected, a home inspector might miss things, right? So on-site auditors might miss things, GFSI auditors might miss things. That's normal. So, the more eyes, the better. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Jen, speaking of on-site audits, do you think it's necessary to go on site for most facilities?
I just kind of saying, yes, I do believe that especially when you're doing the approval of the facility, I think an on-site visit would be really appropriate. You might decide differently depending on the risk of the food that is being produced. So if it's a lower risk item that, maybe it's an ingredient that is very low risk and going to have processing later, and you understand the hazards very much, that might be a reason not to. But I think for relationship reasons, it's always good to understand what's going on in that supplier facility, and especially for FSVP, because if you are getting held liable for what's going on in that facility, then it's good for you to understand and be on site. But again, that's not always possible. And there are the tools that we mentioned before, and especially the GFS audit. There's ways to get to the answers without being on site, but I encourage it for branding and for liability reasons to at least do it once, at least be on site once.
Right, and definitely the high risk vendors
Yes.
as well, and
Yep.
certainly the branded ones.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. All right.
Yeah, we all are in situations, just to reiterate the relationship piece. I mean, if we've learned anything during the pandemic, I think that personal touch, those on-site visits, the relationship building moments, we have missed that. It's hard to do on the phone. It's hard to do on video conference. We've made do as the food industry, and as any industry, we've made do with what we have been given because of restriction and requirements, right? Our government said you have to stay home. But there's something too about that relationship building moment and really getting insight. Like, people might bring their walls down to show you more what's going on in the facility and help you understand and know your suppliers better.
Right. That's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jen. It's always enlightening to have you on. Safe Food en Route, there's their contact information. Give them a call if you're looking for any support. I get a lot of tremendous feedback from their business and organization. I know our whole team of experts are there and ready to help if you need it. So I think back over to you then, Amy.
Yep, absolutely. I know we've still got a couple questions in the question box waiting for us to answer. But really quick, I'm going to show you a couple of our upcoming webinars. All of our webinars, as you probably know from registering for this one, are free to register. So go ahead and sign up for as many of them as you'd like. I know we've got a couple more beyond these, and then we'll be off for, I believe, what is it, a month or two going into autumn, Paul? And then hopefully we'll have a full slate in the winter for you all again. But let me go ahead and open up the questions tab. If you have any other thoughts or questions you wanted to ask before we wrap things up, please send those over. But just to start, Jen, it looks like we have a question here from Jared. Jared asks, I'm curious how FSVP works with brokers. Does it apply if you are not the direct importer?
That's a great question. So depending on the relationship that the broker has, so you may not legally be able to act as FSVP importer, because if you are not the owner of the product, if you're not US customer and you're not US consignee, and you're just helping kind of manage some of the paperwork in the background and manage the customs paperwork legally, you can't act as it. Now, the question comes to you, and something that I've seen is, what's the value you could add? So maybe facilitating those conversations so that people, the customer and the consignee actually have the conversation, who is responsible. It could be, to me, it's a selling point for brokers. If you're in the office, you could take ownership of it, but again, that kind of changes your definition, right? But taking ownership or that US consignee position, so that you're now offering value to whoever you're representing in the transaction. Are you representing the supplier to the customer? Then you could be helping add that value of being the FSVP importer on their behalf. And I have personally, my company has relationships with companies like that. So we help the brokers. There's companies like mine that act as FSVP agent, and the broker helps organize all that and make sure that we have all the information we need to be able to conduct the activities on the behalf of their supplier. And then the big thing is being very clear who owns the product when it's in the United States. If you're shipping kind of like direct duties delivery paid, DDP, to the customer, and the customer takes ownership, technically, legally, the customer is supposed to be taking that responsibility. If you're shipping to a warehouse and the foreign entity, the foreign supplier still owns the product in that warehouse, it's sitting in the United States in a warehouse, the warehouse doesn't own it, the foreign entity does. You can hire an FSVP agent to act on your behalf, and that's where some of the companies like mine come into play.
All right, great. Let's see. I got a bit of a long clarification here from Brenda, so bear with me. If you need me to repeat any parts of it, Jen, let me know.
Okay.
Brenda's wondering, is it correct to say that materials imported into the US that would fall under FSVP but require further processing need not fall under FSVP if instead they fall under a company's supply chain program and are addressed under their PCHF?
Yes, that absolutely, that is true. The part I would and just for other attendees that are still on the call, the clarity here is you have to do a supply chain program, right? So that's part of your preventive controls plan. That's part of the regulations. If you're not falling under preventive controls, in that rule, then you need to revisit where you stand as FSVP importer. But Brenda, you're right. You are covering it and proving, as long as you can prove that you're managing the hazards and have appropriately thought them through in your supply chain program, you should be in that exemption category and managing it a different way. I encourage manufacturers to write their foreign supplier program anyway, or write it into their supplier compliance program just to make sure that they're taking it into consideration. So that would be the one advice that I would say, is just make sure that you're mentioning that you're taking the foreign supplier verification program rule into consideration, and you might just write it in your policy that you've ruled it out, that you don't need to, because all products that are being shipped to you from foreign entities are going to be further processed and then have that proof.
All right, great. We've got a question here from Karina regarding radiological hazards. Is there a recommended list, detailed list of countries out there to consider when it comes to radiological hazards?
That's an excellent question, and when you find one, let me know, and I would love to share it with my
Share
team.
the knowledge, Karina.
I'm sure there's something, and I'm sure that, like, to me, Google is one of the best friends that we have as a team. So, there's the common places that we know have had it, like Japan. We know they've had a radiological concern. We know that somewhere in the Russia area has, where we don't necessarily import food into the United States. So do we have to consider that? One that's been, and this is just me going down rabbit holes, I don't know the answer to this. I've just had the thought come into my head of, like, what about radon? We have radon tests done in our homes in a lot of different parts of the country. How does that affect the food? So those are scientific questions that I would send to my team that's doing the technical evaluations, but those are just random thoughts that I have about it.
All right, great. It looks like this might be our last question before we wrap things up. This one is from Nadine. Nadine is wondering, is it safe to interchange the terms supplier evaluation and supplier performance?
I don't see why not, as long as you're describing it. So if you have your FSVP plan and you're referencing your supplier performance or supplier, you're basically just doing supplier performance and I wasn't probably very clear about it. Supplier performance to me is monitoring, ongoing monitoring of that supplier, so continuously paying attention. Supplier evaluation is kind of like that initial evaluation, and then the evaluation on a every 3 years basis required by law, or I recommend annually, because to me that's part of the performance. So it's slightly different, but similar enough that you probably could interchange them. You just want to make sure that you have clear definitions in your policy.
All right, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen. I'm going to go ahead and pop the slide with your contact information back up on the screen, just in case anyone had maybe any other questions that, maybe you're a little shy, you don't want to ask your question live on the air. That's totally understandable. So you can shoot Jen an email here at her email address anytime. If you have any other questions, in general regarding FSVP or PGRFSI's services, you can reach out to us at pgrfsi@pgrfsi.com. Any questions you send our way, we will do our best to find the right person to answer that for you. And Jen, I just wanted to say thank you again so much for taking the time to present for us. Another great presentation as always, and as usual, we're looking forward to the next one with you.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate the time and always appreciate the audience and exposure. If there's anything that anyone is needing help with, we do, as Paul mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work in the FSVP space, but we also do consulting in food safety and regulatory. We cover, FDA, USDA regulations, GFSI, a lot of the audit schemes as well. Sorry. So I'll end it at that since my dogs are entertaining the webinar as
The
well.
perfect punchline.
Right, like they're like, okay, you're done. So sorry, the thunder is rumbling.
All right. Thank you again so much, Jen. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend today's presentation. As I said at the beginning, the slides will be available from the PGRFSI website, and we will also have the recording posted to our YouTube channel, usually within the next 24 to 48 hours. So with that, I'll wrap things up. Just wishing you all a happy and safe rest of your week before the weekend, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.